morning, everyone. Welcome to the Community and Economic Development Committee for January 12th. Let's go around and make introductions. I'm John Weddleton.
Dick Green.
Pete Peterson.
Dave Whitfield, current planning.
Terry Sawtell, planning manager.
Brian Coyle, AK Green Labs owners.
Carol and JW.
Ryan Yo, current planning.
Amy Kibosky. Erica McConnell, OECD.
Lou Weaver, Alaska Slow Burn.
Drew Malone.
Jack Frost, code enforcement.
Chris Usher.
Mike Morgan.
Jane Stinson. Michelle Ritter.
Tim Potter. Dell.
Hey, Jack, do you want to sit up at the table? We might get some questions for you. Okay. Okay. So first on the agenda is Alaska Green Labs, and we had obviously some ongoing issues with that. So we've got a. Did you get a copy of Erica's writing?
I did, yes. I was
Summary,
reading it here.
just kind of outlining the issue there. And the first thing is just for committee members. Oh, and just general rules, which many of you know, is this is a assembly committee member meeting, so I will kind of direct you guys to talk about it a little bit. So if you want to chime in, just go like this. But generally we'll go assembly members to speak first and kind of make comments, but anyone involved, if you have a chance to respond, and even people out on the periphery, if you go like this, if we have time, we can kind of break you down and you can add it or use that. So I think with this, we have an issue we've run into with the land use thing. So just for committee members, what is our goal? We're going to look at this and review it for.
I want to see what we can do to let this guy operate without being a real problem. I don't see a long-term solution, but I don't want him to sit there not being able to operate, because it's one of two testing labs we needed working.
Okay.
John Finance.
Sure.
Just to start the conversation, it might be helpful, like we do with all the other applicants, just to have staff give us just a quick analysis of baseline. There may be those who hadn't gone back and heard the audio.
Sure. Okay. That was kind of my intent. I just want to make sure we're directed here. It's one thing is, well, it is what it is, and we proved it with conditions. Conditions were met, and other people are starting to do it. So this one's isn't above what we've seen before. But okay. So I just wanted to at least get it. Did you have any?
No, I'm right. I want to just basically get back on the record the status of where we are with this application and what the challenge is, and then maybe talk about solutions.
Okay. Okay. Good. So Erica, you want to give us a lowdown?
Sure. So AP Green Labs is one of the two testing facilities that have been proposed in Anchorage to date. They applied, I think, probably in June, would have been, or maybe July would have been about right, for with the intent to get on the assembly meeting in September. And this body looked at the application in August, at this meeting of August 18th. Through the review of this application, the fact that there were multiple uses on the site that all had parking requirements was kind of missed. And so it was not brought to light at that time that there was a parking problem with this site. This was not brought to the Assembly's attention. The Assembly was led to believe that parking was not a problem, and so parking was not added as a requirement to resolve. And unfortunately, also, Mr. Coyle was mistakenly informed that he did not need a change of use permit. So the Assembly approved the application in September, and things went happily along until the end of December, when Mr. Coyle called for his marijuana inspection, and it was discovered that he did not have a change of use permit. So we thought, okay, that's bad, we're very sorry, but you need to get that, but it should be very smooth because you've been through this whole process. And during the review, during the change of use permit, this parking issue was discovered. So essentially, when the building was built in 1972, it was required to provide 12 parking spaces, and at that time it only provided 10. No idea how that happened in the early 70s, but I think maybe many of you who were here at the time know that things were a little bit more fast and loose back then. Since that time, so there's parking on the east side of the building, and there's well, there's space for parking on the east side of the building, and then there's what's kind of more, official parking on the west side on Fairbanks Street, the east side of the building with on an alley. Since that time, either the property owner or other tenants, it's not exactly clear who, placed two Connex boxes on the alley side, on the east side, in an area that is designated for required parking. And so a property that was supposed to have 12 spaces is actually providing at this time only 5 spaces. It's unclear to me exactly how many uses are actually in the building. There've been a couple of different numbers thrown out. And I think at this time, we're also not exactly sure what all those uses are. We know there's Mr. Coyle's Lab, there's a cigar store, there's a cigar club. There appears to be a residential unit, and I think there may even be one other thing. Again, I'm not exactly sure. There's been different information. So, so Mr. Coyle has been working with the traffic engineer to try to resolve this, and what the city needs is we need an understanding of what uses are on the property so that we can determine what the actual parking requirement is, based on what those uses are. And Mr. Coyle's already done a parking study, and once we understand what the actual parking requirements are, the traffic engineer has indicated some willingness to entertain a parking reduction and to provide time for the violation, that is the Connex units on the east side, to sometime like a 6-month window for those to be removed, which would allow Mr. Coyle to start operating and come into full compliance later. The problem, as I understand it at this time, is that the property owner who has the knowledge that we need has been out of state and is not really reachable, and so Mr. Coyle's having trouble providing the city with the information that the city needs. That's kind of my understanding of the entire situation.
I can fill in some of the uncertain information for you if you like on the uses in there. There's as you said, there's My Lab, there's a cigar shop, and there's a cigar club, and then there's the residence on top of the cigar shop, and then there's a warehouse behind the cigar shop. It's just rented as a warehouse. There's no business running out of there.
But it's not associated with the cigar store or the cigar shop. So it's rented to a different person.
It's, as I understand it, they're all rented by the same person,
Like, oh, okay.
but there is no commercial relationship. It's not storage for the cigar shop.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Who owns the Connex?
The fellow who's renting the rest of the building.
Is it, can I ask a question?
So that would be, you mean the owner of the building, or you mean the?
No, the
cigar
other
shop?
tenant.
Or the cigar shop?
There are 4 other spaces in the building, and it's all rented by the same person.
Now, the Connex is an authorized use for the land, or they just,
They are located in required parking.
okay, but they're not allowed to be there, right?
I can't remember how they can't be there because they're in required parking. If it was other space, I can't remember whether they're allowed to be there or not. It may be that one is and one isn't, but I'd have to look that up. But essentially, they can't. Speed 3. But essentially, they can't be there because they're taking up required parking.
What's the
One
process
short
for
of
getting
parking
them
to
out of
start
there?
with, and then took away 2 more. They're supposed to have 12, they only had 11, they took up 2 with the conferences.
What's our process for getting the Connex out of there? Do we put a notice on it? Will it be towed away in 72 hours, or is there any process for it?
No, there's not. I think you're working with the owner, weren't you, on the conferences?
The owner has the other tenant in court now, has for a few months, trying to get him to move the Connexes. He's trying to evict them from the residence as well, so there's a legal action going on there that just complicates the situation there. I've talked to the tenant, other tenant quite a bit. He's willing to move the Connexes. It's just getting everybody together and agreeing that it's gonna work. And with the owner out of town, he hasn't been able to participate in the process.
Thank you, Jeff.
Can I ask
S. Hogan.
Did you have more to add then? Jan?
So when the staff report was first done, I believe that it just looked at Brian's use and Brian's space, and it found that it was in compliance. And then when Brian had to file this change of use, that's when all these issues started because it's a strip mall and you have to bring the entire building up, which is what we're seeing with a lot of businesses. So I asked Erica, where does the requirement for this change of use come from? And she said 2103 100 E1 small b. And so that reads, in the municipality, a land use permit shall be required prior to B, changing the principal use of a building as defined in change of use in chapter 2114. So changing the principal use of a building requires a land use permit. So we're already doing a special land use permit. We're already doing a land use permit. Why do we need an additional change of use if we've already satisfied section 1 here by getting a special land use permit?
Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that, first of all, the special land use permit is a special land use entitlement.
Mhm.
The land use permit that's stating is a change of use of the building. So when you have a principal change of use from one use to another, you have to go through a permitting process to change that use. So two distinctly different processes.
So, but if they are two distinctly, why does it just say a land use permit and it doesn't say a change of use permit? Or why doesn't it use that phrase? I mean, it seems like change of use is like a term of art here in, regulatory interpretation 101. If you have a change of art, use a term that's a term of art, you use it. But here we just have a land use permit, and it just seems like the understanding at the beginning of this process was the planning department saw the special land use permits as, sufficient under this section and didn't require this change of use permit. And then at some point, around September, or late September, we started seeing this overlay of an additional permit. And I'm just wondering, is that necessary? If we're going through the special land use permit process and we're getting renewed every year, why do we need the overlay? Is there something else it's protecting? Francis has an answer, I think.
Francis?
Well, Jack Frost is more, I'm sorry, he
Sorry,
probably
I didn't
answered
see
the
it.
question better than me, sorry.
Do you want to defer to?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Jack, comment?
The change of use permit is required on every single change of use regardless of the special land use permit or not. What that's doing is if you take a look and see, hypothetically, there was a medical office in here, and so now we're gonna put in a bicycle shop. So that has different parking requirements, perhaps, it has different landscape requirements, all different types of requirements. So that has nothing to do with the special land use permit, or in this case, marijuana related. That's required for every single construction, every single change of use. So that's basic, and then, so it's not an overlay, that's the basic requirement for all.
So
And then
it's
the special land use permit then specifically addresses the
So
marijuana.
nothing
type.
has changed in the rest of the building?
So what we look at that point is that we look at the combined uses and specifically get down to all the requirements for each individual use to see if collectively they all are compliant or they require amendment of some sort.
Okay, so the immediate prior use in this specific suite was a marijuana testing lab. Now it's marijuana testing lab.
Which did not have a change of use permit from what it was before that. I mean,
Right, but nothing has it. I mean, it just seems like, the building went from being a milk building to growing basil in it, or whatever it grows, and it doesn't have a change of use. Actually,
ACW went from a storage facility to a public performance venue, no change of use. Tenant improvement.
That's true.
And I've found many examples of this.
So I guess my question is, this specific one, it was a marijuana testing lab beforehand. Yeah, maybe it didn't go through a change of use before that, but it seems like, a bunch of shops haven't gone through a change of use before that, and now, are we supposed to go back and be responsible for what other tenants did before we got there?
My guess is on the TIs, the tenant improvements that you'll see, if you'll pull the folder in felt pen across the top, it'll say change of use, even though it's a tenant improvement. Because the first thing that you look for is this use permitted? And is it the same as previously? If it's a change of use, then they simply write it on the folder, and you'll see it as it's just a TI. but for us internally, it's a change of use.
Okay, so-
That's how we do it.
So for Brian specifically, beforehand, it was a marijuana testing lab going to a marijuana testing lab.
How was that
It was
word?
non,
That
it was non-permitted, it was non-permitted, or non.
It was before the regulations came out.
So it was testing personal growers.
Oh, is that right? Maybe.
But did testing personal growers go through the municipality to obtain the appropriate change of use?
They didn't go through any process.
That's the point, and that's the point that the department's making. Is it my turn yet?
Yes.
Okay. So, for me, though I see where Jana's coming from, I don't find, that argument compelling. So I'd like to go back to Erica's, analysis. And I think, there was two things. First of all, I thought maybe potentially that the, ordinance that we just passed might give the department director discretion to allow a 6-month. But after further consultation with those in the know, that's not an opportunity. So, I think for me personally, moving forward, I understand the challenges Brian's going through. I'm trying to contact the owner and all this, and I think Erica has given us a great solution. And that solution is on the back of page 4. And right here she has it. It says one option would be for the assembly to issue a 6-month parking variance to Alaska Green Labs. So that was kind of, even on Tuesday night when I was talking to Brian at the assembly meeting, I was kind of thinking, well, we might be able to amend the conditions in the previously passed AO, which if you look at it, it's condition number 9 is the one that we're talking about. And this is the either establish non-conforming rights, or maybe we could add an condition, but I'm assuming we would just modify this somehow. But I think that would probably be the easiest way to do it, because obviously the department found an error and making sure this lot is not conforming for the parking, and Stephanie's looking at the parking situation right now. So I think that 6-month leeway will accomplish 2 things, and I think it will satisfy both parties. The one thing is he can get to work sooner rather than later, which I think is probably in the best interest of the community, because right now we only have 1 testing lab, and I think it would be very beneficial for the community to have 2 or more than 1. But secondly, it would give the opportunity to the department to appropriately address any issues with the property, and they don't feel like, they're being rushed or just putting a Band-Aid on something that really needs to have a long-term solution. So I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. How that exactly is accomplished, I'd have to defer to Erica and ask her to explain to us if there's any. My hope would be that we could just introduce something on the consent agenda, and we can modify that way, but I'm not familiar if, I don't know if at the top of my head if we need to do public notice and all that kind of stuff. I think it would need to be done by ordinance. It couldn't just be done by modifying the resolution, because it would be essentially waiving a portion of code. So I think it would require an introduction and then a hearing. Yeah. So even though this is a resolution, we look at these 2 resolutions, we can't modify a resolution? Because you would be you would be basically waiving a portion of code. So first of all, variance authority for marijuana regulations doesn't at this time lie with the assembly. It lies with the Urban Design Commission, and that's something that we're changing in that other AO that we're working on, but we got distracted by joint pedestrian route and modifications. So that will be changed, but at this time, variance authority doesn't lie with the assembly. So we would have to waive, we would have to do a notwithstanding the fact that variance authority doesn't lie with the assembly is doing this. Yeah, so, I think it's doable, but it needs to be done by ordinance. Okay, so my recommendation, and provided as other assembly members don't give me a compelling reason otherwise, I'd be willing to sponsor the AO, in which would give exactly that opportunity. And again, it's a 6-month window. I think it's temporary, but it's long enough for Stephanie to look at the traffic issues and the department to look at everything else, and Brian had an opportunity to get to work. So I would be willing to do that. I would like to introduce it so it's on the docket on the 24th. If it's on the 24th and it's published, can I take it up for action on the 30th if we have that special meeting?
But that's,
So we'll check into
okay, that would be my hope, because typically there would be 2 weeks between. But there might be an opportunity where we have 2 assembly meetings, week to week, back to back, if we run into a lot of interesting ballot propositions. So,
If we run into one.
you're welcome. I know, you're all excited to listen about fluoride. So that would be my hope. So I'll just sit back and listen to the other committee members, but that's kind of my thought on how we can solve this and solve it so both parties can reasonably address the issue.
Eric, does that make sense to you? That put me down as a co-sponsor so we can make sure we get this thing through.
So the end of the month is absolutely as soon as we could possibly do this.
I think unless we get the final information from, get the parking agreement, that form that you're working on, I mean, unless somehow that can be done more quickly, I think this is the fastest.
And Pete, that's kind of why I was pushing to see if I could just by resolution.
I know.
And, yeah, if it has to be by ordinance, you're stuck in that, requirement of public notice.
Just have a quick question. My understanding is we have a solution that works on the site for parking, is that correct?
Right.
So, what I'm getting at is most of the time, this goes on with every building in Anchorage a lot of times. We go open and do CCOs on buildings all the time. There's no reason to create an ordinance. If the parking can be worked out, you can do that during the permit process, wait for CCO, then the conics and all that can be moved by the CO time, but still allow them to open under CCO. There's no ordinance needed for this at all. You just move forward. Like any permitting, like any other building, just because it's marijuana doesn't mean any difference. We deal with this every day. And so as long as the permit shows the parking that works, we should be able to get a permit, move forward. Then under CCO, Jack's folks do the inspections under CCOs all the time. Typically the main thing in parking is the handicap accessibility is in place to get a CCO. Once we get that CCO, then they give us a period of time, could be the 6 months. Usually it's till August 1st in almost every case. So you can solve that and get it constructed during the summer, get these conics moved by the end of the summer. So I don't think there's a mechanism needed to create a new ordinance. I think it's already in place, and that's the whole purpose of, I would think of codes, is use the codes that are there, that are in place, that are being used every day to solve this, and don't keep creating new laws, because if you create them, there's ways to cause other unintended consequences and different things. I think the mechanism is here. We get the documents, get that approved at the counter. Obviously, there was some type of parking mistake that happens. I mean, I think also in this whole thing, terminology is key, and that's the problem here. We're calling it a change of use permit. No, it's just a building permit with the change of use in it. If we use the right terminology, we won't run into this. What am I doing? I'm doing something special, change of use. We don't tell a restaurant to a warehouse to go get a change of use. We tell them to go get a building permit. That building permit gets marked, like Jack says on the top, change of use, if it is a change of use. The processes are all in place. There's nothing new here. It's just a matter of following that and using the terminology. In this case where it says land use permit, typically land use permits are called land use permits when they're outside of the building safety service area, and inside it's a building permit. So the terminology is all there. What happens is they still review it at the counter based upon the use. If it changed the use, they're gonna require you to do all this parking stuff. In this case, somehow it got mistaken, and it does sound like parking was a problem. But the terminology is what's catching everybody, and I've been dealing with a lot of permits. When they come to me, I'm like, wait, this terminology doesn't match the building permit process, so therefore it's confusing for everybody at the counter. They're using the wrong terminology at the front counter, so the front counter doesn't know how to completely deal with it because it's different. It's like, it's a permit with a change of use, and so need to get consistent on that terminology. I think everybody's almost saying the same thing. They're just using terminology that makes it confusing throughout the process. And in this case, we have a way to solve this without a new ordinance. If they come in, front counter can approve that parking as is. We get the CCO as normal through Jack's vote. They get everything done by the August date, and everything's moving forward. So that's kind of what I want to add.
So that kind of hinges on, is there a picture that could be drawn that shows adequate parking that could be
believe so. The parking study that Mr. Coyle gave to me demonstrates that there is available parking even with the existing spaces that are out there. But when you consider the fact that I believe there's 5 different uses in the building, overall, when you're looking at consideration of shared parking, we need to make sure really that this building itself, not just his space, is moving towards compliance with it. And so that's what the shared parking agreement is, a shared parking agreement with reduction. And the intent and the conversation that I had with Jack was that the ADA space obviously needs to be in place, and that was really the condition of, we need to have an updated site plan that does show full development of parking on the site, which will require removal of the connexes. We're in process with the property owner to do that. But we need to get that shared parking agreement reduction recorded with that condition really that it will be done by a certain date and moving towards compliance, because we understand you can't do it right now. So hopefully, I know the owner's out of town.
Has he been in contact with you about this? He mentioned to me that he had.
Yes.
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 Okay.
I mean, as far as moving towards getting the connexes off
Right,
site, all of
yeah,
that, yes, and no
yeah.
parking, yeah. So, I think we're in the right direction. It's just everything, ship going one direction when you're trying to divert it. It takes a little bit of time to get it going back in the right direction. I don't know that we need a special ordinance to be able to do this. I think that we're really right now waiting on an updated site plan and that parking reduction, shared parking reduction to be able to record that, and then we should be good.
Right, just to clarify, so there would be, the standard would be about 12 parking spaces required, and that's not possible to be
No.
shown, but you've said, well, we can reduce it X amount. And that
We
could
can
be
get
done.
9. We have 5 in the front of the building, and there will be 4 in the rear. So there will be 9 total, one of which is ADA van accessible.
Okay, and so there's a little parking study that I think Ryan had done based on video.
Yes.
And it shows, is this valid numbers? It shows.
Yes, he gave me clips of the video as well. I've also made multiple site visits out there to kind of observe it myself at different times. Really, during the day, during his business hours, there's more parking available. It's when you start getting to the evening hours, closer to 5 and 6 o'clock, where the smoke shop next to where this location is starts to get a little bit busier, and there's a bar nearby and other little things that are going on in the area. So even temporarily, it might get tight, but I think long term, once everything's in place, we should be fine, and there will be plenty of parking for both him and his employee and everything else long term.
So in the real world, independent of codes, people find places to park.
Yeah.
I try to. There is parking in the area, and whether or not it's happening legally or not, I don't think the general public knows where the property lines are. When you see the parking down, if you've ever gone down the street, really, there are buildings that are side by side by side by side, the property lines are there. And whether the public knows that because they're parking 2 doors down, that they're not technically on that person's property, I don't think that is happening. And that's not going to be enforced, but there is parking available. And specifically for his use, he's not going to be generating a lot of traffic from the public coming here. Really, it is going to be the staff, and then it's going to be deliveries, and those are coordinated, honestly, when those deliveries are going to be happening as far as testing. And a lot of that is occurring in the alley as well, because that's where drop-off and pickup is going to be occurring, is in the alley. So I feel that this can safely be accommodated, and we're moving in the direction of making sure that everything is code compliant as well.
I'm going to just ask a question while we got Stephanie on deck. So the current code says for testing facilities, which could be broad defined, one spot for 350 square feet, and that's what he's being held to for his, so it's probably 2.5 spots or something, 3. Is that a reasonable requirement? Do they need one spot for 350 square feet?
Well, it's my understanding that it is you and one other employee, correct?
2 employees.
2 employees. So, if it's requiring 2.5 to 3 spaces, that's the number of employees that are there. So, to me, yes, that is reasonable. And that is, and some of the other permits that have come through and conversations, this is all new to everybody as far as the marijuana industry, and I've tried to do my research at looking at what Colorado is doing and Oregon and some of the other jurisdictions, and we're pretty much on par with what they're doing. The only area that is, when it comes to cultivation, actually is having a lot of, I think, a more significant pull on parking than what we really anticipated, because it can be greater than warehousing, really, based upon the number of employees it really takes to work on the cultivation within it. As far as the testing goes, I think we're pretty darn close to what it is. Retail is the only thing, is it really, when retail first opens up, it has a significant draw on parking as compared to, but it's almost like when a Krispy Kreme first opens up, you're not gonna be able to accommodate parking, and then it dwindles off and it balances back out. And that's why at this time I have not considered any reductions when it comes to retail, because we just don't have a handle on that yet.
I think we're required to have 5, I think it's 5.
It's 4.
Francis was ahead of me, and so was Erica.
I just, I hear a lot of people trying to problem solve to help the business owner, and that's great, but I feel compelled to be, just point out the naysayer argument or whatever, that you know, the big picture thing is that if the business, through one of these problem solving ways, allows you to open, and then it's determined that you don't meet the parking requirement, or you just can't come up with parking out of thin air. Just that, you know, either you have it or you don't. It's really difficult to create new parking spaces that don't exist, right? And so then you have a business open that can't meet the parking requirement, and it's you know, it's a difficult thing to tell a business that you have to like close or something after they've been open. So that's just for the benefit of the discussion. That's the danger of everyone sort of taking these risks to try and assist you know, a particular business that, you know, who's going to have the, you know, the backbone to close them.
In this case, the documents are going to prove that it does work, so that's not even an argument. So I mean, you're absolutely
Hey,
100%.
Ron, we're gonna go around. Sorry, who was next?
Erica. So I'm glad to hear that things are progressing a little bit more. Stephanie, I think what we still need is that signed shared parking agreement, right?
Yes.
So do we know when the landlord will be back in town to sign that, or can he sign it remotely?
He's told me he'd be back Saturday.
Okay, so it does sound like this will be able to resolve it a lot faster than if we went an ordinance route. I was kind of hearing that things were super bogged down, and so was proposing an alternative, but it sounds like it probably won't be necessary.
So, now it's my turn, right? Okay. So that's where I was going, is the fact that the last we spoke, he had no idea when the owner was gonna be back or how this was gonna be adopted, and Stephanie was talking, or, you know, from the comments that were coming from traffic, as they really need the shared parking agreement, and I'm hearing from planning that they needed a new site plan and all this, and it was sounding to me like the applicant and the owner, it was gonna take a while. And so to me, I thought if we had something in the hopper that would give them an option to become compliant within a certain amount of time, no big deal, then it's just an option. But if they get this section done first, or this other option done first, then that would be done. So again, I go back and forth. I mean, if I have no problem introducing the ordinance, but the ordinance doesn't prohibit this other thing from being done. So, you know, like, I can move forward or I cannot. I mean, to me, it doesn't hurt anything if, in fact, he can't get the site, you know, the shared parking agreement. I mean, I don't know. It's an option, but that's why I said we have to work within code. And I hear what Ron's saying, but again, if everybody keeps saying we need a new site plan, even Stephanie's saying she thinks that we have enough parking, it's contingent on multiple other factors. And it hasn't been signed off yet, right, Stephanie?
No.
So again, not being signed off, it's still being hung up in the department. What opportunity do we have other than them fulfilling the needs of the department? And that's why I said the ordinance was the only other option I could see. And I was hoping actually the department director could just do it, but that can't happen. So again, I mean, if you think you're gonna have that signed, then there's no need for an ordinance. But that means if you choose to have us not, you know, Brian, I would love to hear from you, because if we don't do anything, you're completely relying on the department to do the checks and balances and check you off. If we decide to propose an ordinance, you have a unique opportunity where we might have 2 assembly meetings 2 weeks in a row. Otherwise, because of
they're saying we have to waive code, it would have to be an ordinance in order to basically bypass the department and give you 6 months to become compliant. I mean, that's essentially what I'm proposing to do. So if you think you're gonna have it all worked out on Saturday and you don't want us to do anything, great. But if you want us to have a backup plan in the hopper, we can do that too. A backup plan.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not gonna say that everything's gonna be worked out on Saturday, because that's just when, the landlord texted me that he'd be back, and I've sent him this agreement. Like I said, he's in litigation with the other tenant in the building. I'm not sure what effect that's gonna have. Don't take this the wrong way, but I don't have a lot of confidence in the ability of the Muni to move forward in a timely manner on my permit. I've already been waiting for 3 weeks now, since my final inspection. And so, yes, I would like to have another alternative in the works, and I will continue to push my landlord. But one question I don't understand at all is why I am placed in the middle between the city requiring parking improvements for the building, and my business, which is only a small part of that building, is being held up because of that. And I understand that the change of use process identified the non-conformance, but why doesn't the Muni communicate directly with the owner, as he has been talking to me about that, and stop putting it through me and holding my permit up, my permit to operate my business,
Well, I think that-
while the building owner works out his problem with the building.
I hear what you're saying, and I think this is what was partially addressed in our last meeting, is the fact that in order to grant additional permits or licenses or on a particular property, once the city understands that the building itself in its entirety is not compliant, there's a requirement for the city to deal with it, and they have issued a letter to the owner. Yeah, it's my understanding that somebody told us that at the last meeting.
I don't know that.
Somebody said that at the last meeting, that a letter had been issued to the owner, and it was one of the staff, I don't remember who. So my whole point is, right now, to me, I hate to say this, but it's just the situation you're in. You chose to rent in a place that is not in compliance with city code. It sucks, but that's where you're at. But again, I go back to where, you know.
And it's never been in compliance.
Well, again, to me, that's.
Right, yeah.
It's just the reality of the situation, is the codes we're dealing with. So, you know, if Stephanie were to sign this off tomorrow, because parking's a hang-up, if she were to sign it off tomorrow, this is a done deal, but she has requirements that she has to uphold too. And so, again, I go back to, you know, if somehow this is worked out and it's satisfactory to traffic, then the need for the assembly to take any action is not there. However, if you cannot satisfy the requirements from the traffic department, then the assembly option would give you an option to move forward sooner rather than later. So,
And I would still be responsible for making the owner comply. And then if I can't get him to comply, then I go out of business. And then the city goes after the owner himself.
well,
When
and
I'm gone.
I just go back, so this is a whole, again, it goes back to, doing, you know, Patrick Flynn gave this great, speech at one of our assembly meetings about tenants doing due diligence, right? So you need to know what you're getting into, and it, you know, again, I don't know how you would have done that ahead of time, right? This is probably a new endeavor for you, but again, it's not the city's responsibility to make sure every tenant who rents someplace understands the conformity status of that parcel. It sucks, but that's where we're at. So again, to me, we only have a limited time here, and we've already spent 40 minutes on this one issue. I think we have a solution, and the solution that we have is not as quick as you would like. I mean, we can't just sign a piece of paper and say it's done. It actually has to go through a public process. But again, if for some reason you can get this parking agreement, or you can satisfy the concerns of traffic, the assembly solution is not needed. But like I said, to me, this is the quickest way. I tried other ways. As we talked on Tuesday night, I was trying to think of other ways we could do this a little differently. But, you know, again, it goes back to the fair warning. It's the same warning we gave another business not too long ago that's almost 500 feet from a school. You know, variables happen outside of our control, whether it's the federal government coming in, or whether it is the fact that maybe you can't comply with
parking, it sounds to me, everybody's thinking you can. But it's.
And my business did comply, but now the building doesn't comply. You're gonna close down all the other businesses in the building?
We don't
Yeah,
have
that's
the
a
two
great question,
business
actually.
compliant.
Let's go.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
I'll
my,
let you finish.
yeah. My hope is this, I understand the frustration, but the fact of the matter is the assembly in the city cannot take responsibility for an owner of a business. The owner of the business is ultimately responsible. It's not the tenant, it's the owner. The owner's responsible. So the owner, if he cannot comply with parking or refuses to, he's not gonna be able to rent out those spaces. He's gonna lose that income. So again, we have to focus on what's within our control, and the codes clearly state you have to comply with city law. You have to comply with code. And, you know, again, this is a conversation that, you know, you have to work out as the tenant if you want to rent in that particular location, because that location right now is not compliant with code, and now we know it, and so it has to be dealt with. So again, I would go back to the solution on the table. You know, I would love it if traffic just dealt with it and they found this is okay, this will work, and I can sign it off. But if they can't, this option is still a viable option to be able to give them some time to deal with it. But you have to go into it knowing that if you come back in 6 months and you cannot comply, you very well may need to close your business, as Francis warned. Now, I don't think that's gonna happen. From what everybody's saying, everybody thinks you're gonna be able to comply. But I'm just trying to, you know, be reasonable here and hear concerns on both sides and move forward, because frankly, we can sit here and argue about who's responsible, the tenant or the owner, but I don't think it's a productive use of our time.
Thank you. Okay.
Not to drag on, but I agree with Amy, because quite frankly, I want the assembly to have the ability, if we have to use this method, get you an operation. Because I know this guy's coming on Saturday, I don't trust him coming on Saturday. He could say, hey, I'm not coming back for another month, and then you're behind the eight ball. So let's just get this to this Saturday, we can do it. We don't need it, we can simply delete it.
Okay.
Well, the only thing, I'm sorry, the only thing we need the property owner for technically is to sign the parking agreement, because he is the property owner. So when we record something against his property, he has to be the one that has signed it and have it notarized. As far as getting the site plan in and submitted so that we can review and make sure that the 9 parking spaces fit and that it all is groovy, you can do that without the property owner. So really, the only thing that he's hanging out is that parking agreement. If you already have it filled out with all the appropriate information, I can take a look at it, make sure that everything looks good for me. And even if he's not in town, I mean, if he can get it notarized elsewhere and sent to you, I mean, mail, I don't know timing. We've done that way of having people out of town. So really, that's the only thing that you need the property owner for.
Okay.
I mean, we're moving. I mean, I know.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if he shows up on Monday and he's got the signed parking agreement, can we walk this thing through so we can finally get it finalized and get him his permit so that he can get open for business?
If he comes in on Tuesday, yes, because Monday is a municipal holiday. But yes, absolutely. I mean, we're all aware of the sensitivity of this issue. I mean, which is why, I mean, I've tried to be very responsible, you know, make sure that we're moving this forward. And I know it would take time. The bureaucracy is fun. But I personally am here on Tuesday, and anything we need to do, I've been communicating with you. Anything you want to email to me to have me look at before you send anything, I'm happy to take a look at it,
Yeah.
make sure that we're good, and keep moving this
Well, I
forward.
can certainly get it together, at least without the signature.
Okay, that's a good thing to talk when we're done here.
Yes,
Be quick.
yes, we do.
Okay, so, I think Erica, are you still in the queue? You know, I have one issue on if we did an ordinance on this, because, I mean, this sounds like we have this one specific issue, but anytime there's a change of use in a strip mall, this is probably dealt with.
Yes.
And I'm just worried that we set some precedents here. If we do an AO in this case, which this guy's struggling, seems fairly reasonable, there's probably how many more a year where you have a similar issue, where someone wants to open up an ice cream shop and changes the parking and so on, and they get shut down. And,
In 4 years.
just need to know, are we creating a precedent and we're gonna do this for every little business that comes out?
Well, I would say that there's a reasonable justification for this, partially because this issue should have been identified in August and it wasn't. And so and also because you're not waiving the requirement, you're just extending the amount of time that the, business has to address it. So I would think that I would.
So any write-up like the memo with this, we
Yeah.
clear that, like, why is this one special and getting special treatment? So it's crystal clear, we're not opening the door for everyone. I think we need to make a decision and move on to other issues. Ron, really brief.
I was just saying, I have 3 that I'm doing it right now. You just do a shared parking agreement, you come in, you work with the department, they sign it and move on. So it's not a big deal at all. It really is, and I think that there was just some confusion here, and it got to a point where somebody didn't know that it's that simple to do. It's really not that big a deal.
It's big, we have 30 people on here over there.
I'm just saying, I mean, I do this all the time, I do it with.
I think we're ready to move on.
We need to move on.
The only thing I would say just in closing is, we have all identified earlier, we said this, 2 weeks ago at our meeting, if there was a shared parking agreement, this would be a non-issue. But the reason it's become an issue is because the tenant can't get a hold of the owner, and the owner's not responsive, so there is no shared parking agreement. There is a hypothetical of a shared parking agreement, and that's why I keep saying, like, I purposely keep saying traffic instead of 70, because I don't want to put you on the spot. But, the fact of the matter is, if you can satisfy, traffic that this is taken care of, then it's a non-issue from the Assembly's point of view. But if you keep saying, well, the owner's gonna do a shared parking agreement, but, you know, he's not, I mean, there isn't one. So, again, that's why we're trying to, and again, like Erica said, it was just missed in August when we first went through this. Otherwise, it probably could have been addressed a long time ago. So, you know, we don't wanna punish somebody because we missed something either. And so that's why we're just trying to do it. But Erica and I have been sidebarring a little bit. She's gonna go ahead and write up the AO. We may not even need to introduce it. We can hold it to the addendum, right? So we can hold it till next Friday, and if there's not a resolution, if the owner says no, then we can introduce it on the 24th. But if it's not resolved by then that'll be your backup plan.
Okay.
But if it's resolved by then there's no need for it.
Okay, so you're gonna pursue your conditional certificate of occupancy, and then we'll also have to say, oh, and move on from there. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, moving on to the Betcher?
That's the way I've been pronouncing it, the Betcher subdivision.
Betcher subdivision rezone fee waiver. And Terry, you wanna give us the summary on that?
I can do that quickly, Mr. Chairman. The Betcher subdivision came forward for a rezone now, I think first in 2015 and carried over into 2016. It was, the applicant in that case was requesting a rezone from R3 to R4, and with the hopes of actually getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 units on the site, if I'm not mistaken. And the neighborhood was really not approving of where that was going. The planning, it came before the Planning and Zoning Commission, was denied. And, it further went on to the Assembly and went nowhere there as well. So, but there's an underlying problem with the property that would hopefully have been addressed in that rezone to R4.
Just a second. Hey, Brian and Stephanie.
Sorry.
Thanks. Go ahead, Terry.
The underlying issue is that, and we have it with a number of properties around town, is that we have special limitations that are attached to the existing property that make those properties almost impossible to develop, and that's the case with this one. There's a special limitation on the Betcher subdivision that they have to, before it can be developed, they have to take access to both Spenard Road and to Northwood Drive. The problem is that parcel in 2005, prior to the current owners having that parcel, was subdivided such that the piece that would have allowed them to go on this Spenard Road was eliminated. It is in someone else's ownership now, so there is no possible way they can meet that special limitation requirement. And to that end, the parcel is really not, as a municipality, we're obligated to provide everybody access. And we are not doing that now. When that subdivision came forward in 2005, that should have been caught by us. We should have said, okay, we've either got to change.
Well, it was also rezoned, that extra piece, and somehow, I mean, this was discussed, and somehow the department and the assembly did not end up addressing this issue, which I find very strange. So it wasn't
It's
like,
very
it wasn't like it
strange.
wasn't known about or caught, it was just not dealt with.
Well, it
So,
just
yeah.
wasn't dealt, it's,
Yeah.
it's fundamentally a mistake, it's a
Yeah.
little bit on our part, but I would also say that some of the responsibility lies on the new owner, because they purchased that property in the process of doing due diligence. If it was me doing due diligence for someone, and I saw a special limitations attached to the zoning of it, that's one of the things I would zero it in right off the bat, but, and on both sides, it was missed. So now we have a parcel that cannot be developed. They've spent, in the tens of thousands trying to get the rezone to the R4, and it failed. And what we're seeking now is simply a variant or a waiver of the variance fee, so that we can just make the property legal fundamentally. And that would be the elimination of the special limitation that requires them to come out onto Spinard Road. It would be modified such that they're only required to go onto Northwood Drive. And there's an existing special limitation that restricts them to 180 units of development. It's roughly a 10-acre site. And there's some concern perhaps, well, can Northwood accommodate that level of traffic? But they have obtained a TIA. This has not been reviewed at this point by traffic. But it's by a reputable firm, Kittleson Associates, prepared this, and fundamentally they've stated that Northwood Drive can accommodate that level of traffic quite easily out to 2032. So on the one hand, I think we have the ability to go in and simply, if they want to do some higher level of development, they can pursue that in connection with the local neighborhood. But we maintain the special limitations that the neighborhood's already imposed of the 180 units. We maintain the other provisions of added buffering and a few of the others that are in there, but we eliminate the offending special limitation that addresses access to Spinard Road. I would also note that as a department, we're working hard to try to minimize special limitations where we can, only because this is what happens when you get them in there. You just don't quite know down the road what's going to come up. So there are special limitations requiring a 25-foot setback to Fish Creek in this one. We can leave that in there, but it's actually new Title 21 has the same requirement. So it's a redundant special limitation. Another one is for obtaining, I think, site plan approval, which was noted by the Planning and Zoning Commission as a redundant one, because new Title 21 would require them to get that as well. So what fundamentally we're requesting is simply that the Assembly approve a fee waiver for the rezone, just so that we can get this parcel legal, and then allow the owner of that property to develop it accordingly.
And can I ask a Sure. Terry, can you tell us if we didn't waive the fee, what would the fee be?
I don't have it right in front of me, but it's
About
significant.
$10,000.
It's about $10,000.
And how much did they pay for their last go round with,
By my estimates, I would say 15,000, not counting any consultants.
and that ended up not being successful?
And it was not successful.
And that was not successful in part because of the special limitation that can never be achieved?
No, it was not successful because the neighborhood did not like the level of density that was proposed for it.
And that was trying to move to R4, right?
To R4. And we're not making any recommendation to go that with this.
Okay, and so I have one more question. When we're looking at the 1991 ordinance that was put up, so what you're really focusing on is Section 3, Item B. And then if we look to our copy of the AIM in Section 1B, right here, we can see where one section says there shall be ingress and egress on both Bernard and Northwoods, but then the AIM that came to us literally said just Northwood.
It did.
And that's the part that was never fixed.
Well,
There was
it
a
wasn't
piece of-
fixed because the rest of the rezone was denied.
I see.
And the other thing is, we cannot introduce elements into a rezone that the owner has not introduced themselves. Is that correct? I'm gonna turn this over to Dave, because he's our expert really on planning, so.
And I think the intent behind what we're trying to achieve here is to make the property developable. I don't think the intent is to increase the dwelling units per acre beyond the 180 that's already imposed on it. I think what we're trying to do is deal with the access issue, deal with the redundant requirements of the special limitations that are already imposed in new Title 21. I think that's really the requirement. That's what we're trying to achieve here, right? So I mean, first of all, I should point out, just as a point of clarification, I don't know that this rezone, the initial rezone, was denied by the Assembly. I think it was postponed indefinitely. So I think there was a recommendation by the Planning and Zoning Commission to deny it. I think the Assembly did not take action on it, so.
Well, we postponed indefinitely. That
Postponed.
means we're killing it.
Yeah. But you didn't specifically deny it.
Right,
So, you know, I would agree with Terry that, you know, if the owner wanted to pursue an increase in density beyond the 180 units that are already imposed on the property, they would do that at their own expense. I think that, I would agree with Erica, this idea of the access issue was probably brought up and known. Why it wasn't dealt with, we all don't know. However, it does make the property undevelopable in that they cannot comply with that special limitation. So I think we have some responsibility there. That would be my.
I agree with you. I have a problem when we impose limitations on somebody that they can never meet.
Well, we didn't. They could have been that when they were imposed.
Well, then, but they can't now.
Eric?
I just wanted to offer an alternative that might be a little bit more efficient if there's an assembly member who is interested in that. Rezones can be initiated by the assembly, so if there's an assembly member who wanted to introduce this as a rezone, then we wouldn't have to go through doing a fee waiver and then having the property owner submit again, that the assembly could just agree to remove that one special limitation or the multiple special limitations of the planning.
But would the rezone have to go back to planning and zoning?
It would.
But would the fee waiver?
You wouldn't need a fee waiver because the administration, or the assembly would be, initiating it.
I guess my question is this, on that topic, is if we were to do a rezone, it would go back through the entire process, but if we were to do a fee waiver, would it?
It would be the same.
Be the same process, but you'd have that extra ordinance and time of introducing a fee waiver, waiting 2 weeks.
That
voting on a
doesn't
fee
sound
waiver.
efficient, it sounds more logical just to do the rezone.
It's just an option.
No, but I think either one is a rezone. It's just, if we initiate it, there's no issue with the fee. And if they initiate it, then we waive the fees. I mean, the process is the same.
I'll do it, I'll do it.
So I just want to make clear, I mean, just before I get Tim, what SLs, my understanding is you just want to get the access SL, so the requirement to go to Cigar Road would be removed. Are you also talking about just cleaning up and get rid of the 25?
I would prefer to clean up, but the only one that's really the tripping hazard right now, the future development is item B.
And if we're gonna do this, you would also do what others have.
So if I were to do it, then they also note, the Planning and Zoning Commission noted number H to be taken out, which is development on this parcel is subject to a public hearing, site plan reviewed by Planning and Zoning Commission. I can't state for certain, depending on how that development was brought forward, whether it would require a public hearing if we took that out, because it depends on how they actually develop the site for housing on it, but it's very likely that it would require a public hearing. So that's one. The other ones that to me are redundant right now are the item C, there shall be a 25-foot setback from Fish Creek at first 15 feet north of Fish Creek, returned to a condition which will allow regrowth of natural vegetation. Largely, that one is now covered under Title 21, which it was not at the time that this special limitation was placed. We can maintain we could actually also eliminate D, maximum 35-foot building height, because there is no development in R3 right now that exceeds a 35-foot building height. In other words, Title 21 right now calls for 35-foot building height for an R3 development.
So 3D is already in Title 21.
It is in Title 21. So the 20-foot buffer is acceptable, and then it comes down to H, whether or not we, and that one could be left in there because I'd say it's not an absolute certainty that it would go to a public hearing depending on how it was developed.
Okay. Okay.
For the setback, Marcus, right there on Fish Creek, I know we've got it covered in Title 21, but for some people in Anchorage, Fish Creek is kind of like a touchstone. You mentioned that they're going to come out in droves, whether it deals with it or not. I just kind of like to leave that one alone, my perspective, because I've seen the people come out when you mentioned Fish Creek.
I've seen them come out when you mentioned setbacks at all.
Well, one question on that though, this says 25 feet, we're still working on our setbacks, isn't it?
Well,
Supposed to be done in
we
a
are
year.
working on setbacks, coming up, it'll be before you guys again, but
Yeah, just ignore Chiaki or.
What if that
You do all the
new
time.
setback says it should be 40 feet? But this, in general, for this kind of site, but this says 25.
because
it
the
should be
code,
25
the Title 21 will still take precedent.
over this CSL. Okay, so whatever.
The more restrictive.
Okay, Tim, briefly?
Yep, a couple of things. First off, this piece of property has an awful lot of history, and I would suggest that you don't get rid of a requirement if you don't know that there's gonna be a site plan review, through the public, based on the way that they actually do the development, multiple buildings versus one big building, that you leave that in based on the history of this property with the community. Goes back a long time. The other item is, when you waive, if the city feels like it's their responsibility that all this happened, which again, they had a party involved with the property who definitely understands the due diligence nature of what should be done and should have made all that known to the owner. But there's gonna be a cost of some kind for advertising, sending out the notices, and the staff putting even a minimal packet together. So while the full amount, based on the size of the property right now, the application fee might be extreme, I'd suggest that you get at least the minimum area fee to cover those costs. Because I think it would be inappropriate right now for the city to absorb all those costs, just to straighten out the property, make it developable, because the current owner, in my view, have parties at hand and involved in it that'd be better.
Amy?
On that point, I think I'm looking at it a little bit bigger picture in that we talk about, housing shortages, we talk about, how do we get more inventory on the market? And if we're talking about 180 units on a parcel like this, I'm thinking it's gonna be probably a lot of apartments or something like that. And so to me, this is exactly kind of the niche that I've heard the administration say multiple times that they want to beef up in the municipality of Anchorage. So I don't think it's inappropriate for the assembly to take that into consideration. And to me, I look at community cost benefit, and it is gonna incur some cost, no doubt, Mr. Potter, when you're going through and the staff has to take time and, go through this process. But I think that's exactly why in code it allows for assembly members to bring something forward. And by the government taking that action, the government's weighing the benefit of bringing this inventory onto the market. And it's gonna have no doubt a benefit to the property owner because they're not gonna have to pay a $10,000 fee.
I'm not disagreeing, but if the assembly wants to initiate the rezone,
Yeah.
if that's how you want to waive the fee, that would be a better way for you to do it.
And that's the way I'm
because
doing it.
even I'm suggesting through the 2040 plan that there's areas that the city should actually initiate an area-wide rezone to get it done. And yeah, as chair of the Live Workplace Housing Committee, co-chair, I would agree, it would be nice to pull that stuff forward. This is a very tricky piece of property.
That's what I'm gathering.
Okay, so any other comments? So what we're looking at is either waive the fee recommended or just have an assembly member to initiate the rezone. What do we think?
I'm leaning towards Erica's suggested method, because either way, what I'm understanding from what I've been told here today is, either way, it's still gonna have to go through the same process, and it'll take an extra step to waive the fees too, and I think that's kind of redundant unless we just bring it forward as a rezone. And you know, I'm looking at the scope of this, and I look at the documentation from 1991, and as I read it, I can clearly see in two different sections where they're not saying the same thing. And by postponing it indefinitely and killing it effectively, the Assembly chose not to correct those discrepancies. So, you know, again, I go back to, I think this one actually is pretty simple. We're not increasing the density, and there's no question, you're gonna have people show up to testify because they don't want that property developed at all. I mean, that always happens, especially when you have a large density, like 180 units. So I guarantee there's gonna be a lot of people that show up and say, no, don't do it, because they wanna see that as a green space. And the fact of the matter is that it's not a green space, it's really a parcel that's intended to be developed. So I personally, as an Assembly member, I would love it if the committee as a whole chose to suggest to move this forward for a rezone. And my focus is, again, is that item B, to deal with the egress issue. You know, I think that's where my focus is. But I would be willing to sponsor it, but I would prefer it if the committee as a whole chose to do that.
And are we looking just then at the 3B, just the access to
Just the
Sonora Road,
access.
not dealing with the other special limitations on this? Okay, what do you think? Do you want to make a motion?
Should come forward from the committee.
Okay, so.
Let's just do the 3B from my perspective.
Okay, and have the Assembly initiative. Does that work with your tools here?
It works perfect fine by me, so.
Do we need the property owner to bless this, or do we just do it?
I don't think so. I think code allows us to bring it forward. Now, if the property owner were to show up and say, don't do it, I want to be landlocked and I don't want to be able to, I mean, that would be unique, but, Mr. Chair, I make a motion that the Community Economic Development Committee, move forward this parcel, for a rezone to eliminate the special limitation with respect to ingress and egress on Smith Road.
Okay, second.
Second.
Okay. And any opposition? So is this sponsored by all of us? Is this comes forward? And I would say in the AIM at least, make as many notes as you can why this is not happening. It's a special case.
Yeah, so, Terry, you gotta make us look good. We want it specific, and we wanna be very clear, what the challenge was back in 91, and what was not addressed, and what we're trying to address now.
We'll make that very clear.
Right,
So-
and again, I think, going to what Mr. Potter said, I think it's important that in the AIM, it also says, you know, we look at the density issue and development and why the Assembly, or the committee anyway, believes it's in the best interest of the entire community to develop parcels like this.
I will do it.
Okay, thank you. Moving on.
One thing, Terry, as soon as you're ready to go, would you make sure that Smart Community Council knows everything about this?
I will.
Their budget last time I looked was $30,000. They're an extremely wealthy community council. I want to make sure they know ahead of time what we're doing.
And I worked closely with that council on a lot of things, so I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, moving on to this AO 2017-10 ordinance to add outdoor storage and vehicle storage associated with a community use as allowed principal uses in PLI and PR districts, and is allowed accessory uses in B3, PLI, and PR districts. This is it.
I think this is,
With Brian?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you need
Dave?
staff.
Where did it come from?
It came from me, but I honestly didn't realize I was gonna be presenting today, so my apologies.
You know, I don't mind, we're having a meeting next week.
We can move it to next week.
Do we have, what's on the agenda?
We don't have.
I think there's no marijuana left.
Because I don't have a problem deferring if Dave wants a little bit of time. I don't have a problem.
I can actually address this if you want.
I can
because I'm
speak
familiar
to
with
it.
it. but
Do you wanna speak to it?
It doesn't matter.
If we get all this done today, we don't have.
It would be nice to have it done behind you.
Whoever wants to do it.
Okay.
So I mean, I guess the idea behind this ordinance was to deal with the need to provide storage in conjunction with community uses. We've identified several institutions in town that otherwise would have to construct a building to provide storage to facilitate that use. And so with this ordinance, what we're trying to do is to allow outdoor storage of materials and vehicles in conjunction with that community use. So we're looking at APU, we're looking at UAA, we're looking at Providence Hospital. So those are that's essentially the idea behind this ordinance. So we're trying to allow more flexibility in how they store materials and vehicles in conjunction with their use.
Okay, Dick?
Would this allow churches, for example, to store vehicles on their property with no constraints at all as to how they're stored?
I don't believe churches are identified as a community use.
So would you check for me, because there's University Baptist Church down the street that has about 60 cars in the back of their church. And they say they keep them there and they have parishioners coming from out of town to use them occasionally.
The churches are, I'm sorry to interrupt, but through the chair, the churches are not considered community use.
That's fine.
Where is the definition of community use?
Well, there, if you were to go into at the start of chapter 5, you'll see a table of uses. And there's a subcategory of community uses. Pardon me?
Is it?
Yeah, the community use category includes church, religious assembly.
So churches are included?
I think that, this is my ordinance, but I think maybe the intention was that community use referred to something like a public hospital or a public university. But we've got this use category, Title 21, the table of allowed uses, which refers to like child care centers, homeless shelters, aquariums, boarding schools, and things.
I would note that there are special use requirements that are associated with that. So for example, if the church has this parking lot that's associated with their church, that they are required to screen that, which right now, I mean, even the bus parking lot over here technically is in violation of existing code.
Well, Terry, just drive down the street, Rivers Baptist Church down right before the race committee, look behind their church there, right onto the road, car after car. They never move.
Brian?
We bring up a lot of good points, but I will just, excuse me, just point out that we're only allowing this outdoor storage accessory to community use within the B3, the PLI, and the PR district. So if that church is outside of those districts, we have to allow it.
Any other comments? My concern with this is with I guess my broad philosophy is good for government, it should be good for business too. I mean, there was one point we were gonna ban connexes, except for public uses. Wait a minute, if they're ugly, they're ugly, if they're loud, they're loud. So I look at this just community uses, and I'm going, okay, well, if you're in B3, you have you're a contractor or something, and you need a big lot to store your stuff. You don't get to do this, only if you're a childcare center, a cemetery, a community center, crematory, government, administrative, civic facility, and so on. And so it just rubs me the wrong way to say, good for government, not good for private business.
So I would suggest one thing on that. If you take a look at the table of allowed uses, that is an allowed use in like the I-1 zone, in the I-2 zone, in some of the other ones. What we're trying to make it a very good case in point, I think, is UAA has a separate parcel that's on the south side of Providence Drive. They've used it as a laydown yard. They've spent $1 million, probably, maybe more, getting that approved for flood hazard, for a bunch of other things. And they've been using it, they used it for construction of the new engineering building and that. And prior to that, they'd had their storage on the sort of the backside of the campus where it was much more obvious and adjacent to residences. So what they would like to be able to do is to use this storage where the laydown yard is now, which is on the north side and adjacent to Piper, I believe, but very well screened. And it doesn't impact any residences. It serves their purposes very well, but it's a separate parcel from the rest of the campus. And the benefit that is to the community is that, well, it's really well screened. If they had to move out of there, that has to go back. They would have to spend another $500,000 to $1 million to redo that site and then reestablish storage where it is close to residences on the main part of the campus. So that's part of what made us take a closer look. But the fact is that Parks has a requirement for being able to store things, which is now not addressed in Title 21. It just was a bit of an oversight, really, in Title 21.
But you might, in that case, and I understand that's a great benefit, it makes total sense to me to allow that. But if you take UAA and change that to Big Joe's Contracting, it would benefit him, but he doesn't get it.
But Big Joe's Contracting is likely to be in an I-1 zone somewhere, and he does have it.
That's, it's rubbing me the wrong way. Big Joe can't get it, but the UAA can, and Providence can, and others. The average guy, sorry, you're on the left.
Just one more point, Mr. Chairman. Outdoor storage accessory to commercial use is an allowed accessory use. It's permitted in the B3, the MC, the I1, the I2, and marine industrial. So that Big Joe's Contracting can do it as long as it occurs on the same lot. But they would not be able to do it as a principal use on a separate lot.
And this ordinance wouldn't change that at all. It wouldn't allow anything different than Joe's Contracting would on their B3 lot.
Yeah, but if you're Providence or UAA, you can do it as a principal use on the lot.
In the B3 district, it can only be accessory to.
Or the B3 with this.
Correct. So if you take the UAA situation, they have that on a standalone B3 lot. They would need to rezone that property to PLI in order to do what they're currently doing.
Maybe even after this, not after that. After this, they would have to rezone that. part of
And
PLI.
they understand that.
I'm sorry, what is it zoned now?
It's on B3. Yeah. But because it's a uniquely identified parcel and not on the same parcel as UAA, they would then have to rezone that parcel to PLI.
So what happens if we just delete associated with community uses throughout this thing and let it go? What have we done?
Well, boy, I think I'd have to think about that a little bit, John, and see, what the potential ramifications of doing that are.
Can they rezone to PLI? Is it big enough?
It is big enough. And it's adjacent to PLI.
It was originally zoned PLI, then under the Mental Health Trust, when they owned it, they rezoned it to B3 with special limitation. And now it would be rezoned back because UAA has purchased it to incorporate it into their campus.
We can fund government if enough people did that.
Absolutely, for revenue stream.
Any thoughts?
I have a couple questions. Just make sure I'm understanding this correctly. I think I am, and anytime we start messing with Chugagi Warmers B3, I always start paying attention, but especially because our downtown corridor is primarily B3, and it's right next to residential, so I don't want to see anything ugly necessarily. But what I'm understanding is that even in Chugagi River in the B3, it would still have to be an accessory use. It couldn't just, because I'm thinking of a couple lots that are just plain lots. We're not gonna have all of a sudden right in the middle of the heart of Eagle River, this ugly big storage lot that has a fence around it.
In a B3 zoning district, it would not be permitted as a principal use. It would have to be an accessory use.
That's how I understood. I just wanna make sure I was right.
Yeah.
The second way, and I just wanna make sure anytime I start saying storage stuff, ordinances or anything like that, I don't think this would have any impact, but I'm thinking of like Bass Pro Shop. and the votes, yep, exactly. Somebody talked to me about, the potential impacts of that, retail establishment, or if there would be any, I don't see that there would be any.
Doesn't affect that at all.
Yeah, I
This
didn't
ordinance
say, I just wanted to hear you say it, so it's on the record. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so, we need to move on, we got about a few minutes for each close if we hit it. Any more comments on this? So what do you recommend?
Well, I personally am gonna run this by the chief, I can go over our advisory board, I don't see that my advisory board will have a problem with it. I think that this is, I really honestly don't see how this is so much different than what we're already doing, frankly. But that's just me, maybe I'm missing something. Am I missing something?
Well, if we can't do it this way now, if you cannot store.
Certain particular places, right?
Well, I mean, if you wanted, for example, if Parks had a separate parcel that they wanted to store things on, unless it was used for some other use right now, they could not store things.
And you're
on there.
specifically talking about parks.
It's not just parks, it's UAA, it's APU, it's Providence Hospital, it's any of a number.
But with respect to like what John was saying, with like all other commercial or other owners, other than those specific things you're pointing out, pretty much that's not gonna change their.
It doesn't change them because they now have the ability to have storage as an accessory to their use, and that remains.
Correct, and I think with this ordinance, we're not asking to make storage a principal use in B3, which would make it different than what is currently allowed in B3. It's just like what the B3 currently allows with this contracting business, accessory to that community use.
So with the B3, what our consideration was, because we did think about that, is that B3 is fundamentally commercial in nature. It should not be, we shouldn't be giving that property up to storage. It should be commercial. And if that commercial operation has a need for storage, that's an allowable accessory use to that commercial need. So that's where we came from on that.
I can accept that, but parks are designed for trees and playgrounds and stuff like that, and not for parking lots, as you were saying, but you can use it for parking lot and storage.
Well, Parks has lands all over town. And in many cases, the parks that people really love and appreciate may not be most appropriate places to be storing equipment, whereas they have other lands in town that are out of the way, that are removed from residential districts, that are more appropriate. There's a requirement for a specific size. They have to be big parcels generally to allow this. And it allows it to be stored in a way that it can be screened adequately and not impact neighbors.
My only thing I want to see, what if we delete associated community uses and we just say, why is that critical?
We can take a look at
Yeah,
that. I'm
yeah.
not convinced that that's critical myself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I don't know that it would impact anything, but I'm reluctant to say, yes, let's go ahead and do that without first looking at it and making sure, John.
Okay. So any thoughts, what do you want to do?
Yeah, I lean in the same direction as you actually on that one. I don't know that it's gonna make a break for me. I generally, my initial inclination, is to support the ordinance. I could still support the ordinance taking out associated communities. I could really agree on that one, but again, I would love to hear what Dave comes up with.
And we can take a closer look at that.
So we can take no action on this, you can maybe take a look, maybe send us all an email.
Sure.
And then we can just have that at the assembly meeting when this comes forward, and review that, matter for it.
I think it is for me.
Time to address that issue.
Certainly.
Okay.
So in general, do we have any recommendation for the committee?
That's a recommendation, have Dave look at it closely.
Yeah.
Is that adequate?
Yeah, I think so. We don't always have to make
No,
a recommendation. Like I said, I personally am generally supportive of this, and I could be, depending on what Dave comes back with and says, I could be supportive of taking out that language of associated community use. But I don't wanna jump right in and say yes without understanding the potential impact.
A question on that, if we pull that out, then the title changed a lot, is that?
Well, it would certainly require several more changes to the table of allowed uses. I mean, it would take it out of that community use category and apply it to the entire I'll take a look at that, I'll take a look at the potential impacts, and I'll get back to you guys, very soon.
Well, my point on that is if the title changes, we have to go through the whole process of introduction again.
I don't, I mean, you folks have come up with S versions on.
Yeah, just
You
time.
can't change the title, but we've had it before where we've had ordinances where
Have
it says
nothing
one
to
thing
do
in
with the title.
the, yeah, it says one thing in the title and then we can change the body of it. But if you do wanna introduce, if you wanna change the title, you have to introduce the ordinance.
But we could leave that phrase in
You
there.
can do the title there and
not everywhere else.
not make reference to it in the body.
Okay. Okay, so, okay, good. So now we've got about 3 minutes to do steep slopes. And steep slopes is not totally an easy one. It's still
It is not an
kind of,
I don't think, this one is a complicated topic and I would totally be happy. I don't think it's time critical to build this. I mean, it's been introduced.
Well, here's the time critical piece of it, is that you folks dealt with this in March or April of this year. It sunsetted on December 31st. We're rapidly approaching construction season again, and the sort of Home Builders Association and other folks working on homes and so forth felt comfortable letting it go for a short period of time to be addressed from December 31st into January, but if it were to go significantly longer, it would start happening.
I just want to be on the record saying I was against the sunset. It's the reason I brought it forward last time. I thought this was a critical issue, but I guess the reason I'm asking if it's critical, will it make a difference if we take action on the 24th or the 30th?
I don't believe that it would make that much difference.
do you want to look at this next week then? You know, just look at steep slopes.
Not 3 minutes today.
Yeah, I was just saying not 3 minutes. For me, I think this is a big enough issue. I would be happy having this on the agenda and nothing else.
Okay, so next, we have a scheduled meeting next week with the agenda. And we'll put this on there. Okay, does that work?
It's fine.
Okay, anything else from anyone? You adjourn? Thanks for coming, Sam, we get to come next week.